Hello and welcome to the Educators Going Global podcast. This episode was recorded on July 2nd, 2022. We're going to continue with our big topic, the nature of the beast, with our guiding question of what are international schools, part 2.
I'm going to start by sharing a going global story related to this topic. When we talk about the special clientele we tend to serve in these schools, we mean it. For example, in Senegal, both my husband and I taught the son of the president. Pretty fancy, huh?
Definitely. So today we're going to talk about the typical clientele of these schools and also the very independent nature of most international schools.
Most of these schools have a very diverse student population if they are a true international school. The schools that are named international can be mostly local with just a few families from other countries. We traditionally use the term third culture kids to describe the students who are truly international, moving from country to country with their families away from their home country. The newer term being used today is cross-cultural kids. And these kids tend to fit in better with students of like background than they do with either locals or locals back in their home country.
The nature of the clientele over the past 10 years has changed from corporate and embassy international families more and more to local families of the middle and upper classes, so there are fewer of these third culture or cross-cultural kids. English, though, is the language of study, but it is often not the first language for many students. Some students, in fact, speak multiple languages.
There is the potential at these schools for a rather diverse hiring of teachers from countries other than the United States, even though they're called American International Schools. These schools tend to be part of a close-knit community, and much of life can revolve around the school. You could end up teaching the children of your coworkers or even your own kids.
That's very true. You also can end up teaching students from elite levels of local government and well-known families in local society. There's a good chance that some of your students will be connected to governmental and societal leaders in your host countries, so it's a nice way to have a little influence there locally. Generally, higher proportion of these are dual-parent families. This can be helpful in terms of support at home.
However, the flip side of this is that the parental expectations can be really high, particularly among those who pay tuition themselves versus in situations where the company pays the tuition. The tuitions at these schools are pretty steep. We also want to make note that special needs support is way behind in many of the international schools. If you have a special needs child, you really might want to reconsider going overseas.
So hopefully it's becoming clear that in general, these international schools are more independent and autonomous. Many of them, well, pretty much all of them are private. They're funded by tuition, as we said, paid by parents and sometimes by companies or embassies. The boards usually consist of parents, business people, embassy personnel. It's a mixed bag on who your board might be, especially if it's a for-profit school.
These schools are generally accountable to accrediting bodies and the standards that come along with that. Most of them are accredited by a U.S. education organization, so your years overseas will count for most U.S. state licenses and unions. However, they are not typically teaching to a state or provincial standardized test, and also standards such as those expressed in the No Child Left Behind Act tend not to be part of these international private schools, particularly in the elementary and middle schools.
But do note, especially in the high schools, the very rigorous programs of the advanced placement and international baccalaureate are sought after for many of these schools by the school boards and by the parents, and they can be prescriptive, and they really are important. The schools may also be subject to local governmental oversight to some extent.
One cool thing that we've noticed is that many of these schools focus on teaching critical thinking skills, which can involve project-based learning, teaching in terms of concepts, inquiry, and there are multiple different approaches to pedagogy that are promoted. Generally, classes are significantly smaller than they are in the US. Elementary classes somewhere in the low 20s typically, and middle and high school classes often are 10 or under, but they can rise as well up to about 20, but typically much smaller than in U.S. public schools.
And one of the things that's happened over the last several years is when it comes to technology infrastructure and students having personal computing devices, many of these schools are really set up very well in those departments. One of the great advantages is that the divisions, elementary, middle, and high school, are often on the same campus.
Right, and that leads to the idea of the tight-knit community that I was referencing earlier. And when it's a smaller school or in this type of tight-knit community format, often teachers can have a bigger impact. Also, there are often opportunities for leadership within your division or the whole school, a lot of opportunity to move and try different roles if you choose, as well as sometimes regionally within the school associations.
Another difference from your typical North American, U.S., Canadian public school background is they're not usually unionized. So that brings up the possibility of having feelings of less job security. Another generality is there can be potential high turnover of staff, which often isn't the case in the U.S. or Canada.
We'd like to address a couple of caveats before we sign off. Please note that we did not show you the money. This is because we have a full show on finances coming up. Also, we didn't explain any of these items in detail. That was intentional. Our thought was to list them all out for you here and then to circle back to them later on with subject matter experts in tow.
Definitely. We're going to get the experts in, and we're looking forward to hearing from you, our listeners, to give us feedback as well. Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
and David,
inviting you to travel,
teach,
and connect with us.